speaker tonight. Some of you don't need to be introduced to Robert, but may I say that Dr. Robert Glasser was recently the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the UN for Disaster Risk Reduction. Under that role, he was also the Assistant Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. He's held a lot of different roles, Care Australia, Care International, AusAid, and still has a number of advisory memberships on panels and has had those sorts of roles for many years. Tonight, Robert's going to be hopefully not scaring us too much. Certainly I'm anticipating some shocks from where I'm sitting, but surviving the era of disasters is the topic. So could you all join with me in welcoming Robert Glasser?
Thanks very much, Paul. It's probably better to wait till after the presentation to applaud, just in case, you know. So it's my great pleasure to share with you some thoughts that I have on the trends ahead, and unfortunately, they are rather dark and disturbing. What I'd like to do tonight is explain why I believe we are entering a new era in the defense of Australia. Not because of terrorism, not because of the rise of China, not because of the cybersecurity threat, but because of climate change. As our world warms beyond 2 degrees, which is now looking increasingly likely, we are going to enter an era of disasters that will have truly profound implications for how we organize ourselves to protect Australian lives, property, economic interests, and in fact, our way of life here in Australia. And the early warning of this new era is arriving on an almost daily basis with news reports from across the globe of record-breaking heat waves, droughts, massive bushfires, torrential flooding, record-setting storms. We see this now almost on a daily basis. What I want to do tonight is begin first with a quick update of the latest science on climate change, and I'll draw on the just this last month released IPCC special report, that's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, special report on 1.5 degrees of warming. Secondly, I will explain why I believe the scientific projections of these impacts of climate change that are in that report are greatly underestimate the actual impacts. And in particular, I want to focus on the cascading impacts of hazards, how one hazard can trigger others or compound other hazards and cause these ripple cascading impacts, compounding effects. And then I would like to spend the last part of my presentation talking about some of the implications for Australia and some ideas about how we should begin preparing for this new era of disasters. And then I hope we can have a discussion about the points that I've raised. So first, the first point to make about the science of climate change, the latest update, we have this IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The first point to make about this group, this body, is that it is very authoritative. It involves some of the best scientists actually the best scientists from around the world. Secondly, that it is a very cautious and conservative body. It is not radical. It is cautious for a whole variety of reasons. Firstly, scientists are cautious. They will never say this is what's going to happen because they're always aware of whatever uncertainties exist in the assumptions that they're making. But even more importantly, this is an intergovernmental body. So the summaries are negotiated in effect or agreed through an intergovernmental process. And so the results tend to be very conservative. And we've seen actually, if you look back on the reports that have come over time, what we've seen is that the later reports tend to determine that the assumptions made in the earlier reports underestimate the impacts. And that is also one of the first conclusions from this IPCC report that I want to highlight. We are finding that the risks of serious impacts are actually greater than we assumed. They're not diminishing as the uncertainty decreases, they're increasing. And this current IPCC study, drawing on the most recent scientific evidence, has determined that the 2014 assessment significantly underestimated the risks in 4 of these 5 aggregated categories of impacts. 4 of the 5 categories that were identified, they were called reasons for concern. In 2014, now the latest study, drawing on the latest science, says they've underestimated the impacts. I'll just give you one example. One of those categories is unique and threatened systems. And the threshold for that has now been decreased. This threshold from going from high to very high impacts or high risk, has been lowered from 2.6 degrees down to between 1.5 and 2 degrees. That sounds like a small change, but it's really significant. And it reflects research that, among other things, has now determined, and this is very relevant for Australia, and I'll come back to this later, that 2 degrees of warming will result, this is with very high confidence, 2 degrees of warming will result in the total loss of coral reefs from all of the world's tropical and subtropical regions. Rather morbidly, I think, the report describes this as an opportunity for last chance tourism. So that's the first observation they make. The threshold, the temperature threshold for very serious risk is lower than thought earlier. The second main conclusion that I'll highlight from the report is that there is a huge difference in impacts between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. It seems like a very small amount, 0.5 degrees, but that it's more appropriate to think of that climate changing not as a linear, the impacts increasing linearly, but really almost exponentially as we move up. And let me give you an example from the report of what that 0.5% difference means. It means several 100 million additional people falling into poverty, a 50% increase in the proportion of the global population experiencing water stress, 420 million more people frequently exposed to extreme heat waves, something between like 180 to 270 million more people exposed to an increase in water scarcity, a 10-fold increase from 8 to 81 million people in the number of vulnerable people affected by changes to crop yields, jumping to a 50-fold increase at 3 degrees, just to give you an idea of the scaling. So that's the second observation, that the difference between 1.5 and 2 is enormous. And of course, from 2 to 3, again, enormous. The third point, which puts all of the rest of this, creates the sense of urgency about these other 2 points, is, and this is the bit that received the most publicity in this of the report, that it is going to be unprecedentedly difficult to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. They suggest in the report how we can do that, but it requires a historically unprecedented change in energy systems, in society more broadly. And in fact, the conclusion is that we are likely to exceed 1.5 degrees. And in fact, that 2 degrees will be keeping warming to 2 degrees will be enormously challenging. And in fact, if you just look at the commitments countries have made in the Paris Agreement, we are on track for 3 to 4 degrees of warming. That's the latest science update, which is not a very pretty picture. Now I want to talk about why that not very pretty picture underestimates the impacts. As bad as those impacts are that they've described, they almost certainly wildly underestimate the impacts because they fail to adequately address the way hazards interact with each other and create cascading impacts with human systems. Because of the analytical complexity, most of the research, including work, and the IPCC acknowledges this, including the work reviewed by the IPCC, treats particular climate hazards as independent variables, rather than as part of a wider context in which they're interacting in the way I've described with other hazards and with human systems. For example, they may focus on the impact rising temperatures will have on agricultural productivity, but not on the compounding impacts of flooding, drought, fires, increase of pests, saltwater inundation, cyclones, migration of people, all those other impacts that greatly exacerbate the original one. Just to give you an example, there was a World Bank study earlier this year. It was a major study warning that more than 800 million people, which is almost half of South Asia, reside in areas that by 2050 will become dangerous climate hotspots with enormous economic impacts. In many of these places, drops in GDP of 10% or more. But the authors note that their results don't address, for example, the increasing severity of storms, changes in water resources, sea level rise, climate-induced migration, the compounding impacts multiple shocks can have on the economy and on the resilience of communities. They're very upfront about that. It's too difficult to get their heads around that analytically. And as I said, the problems is that incorporating these knock-on effects is analytically extremely challenging. The IPCC recently commented that, just to quote them, there are very few projections of compound extreme events, and interactions between multiple drivers are difficult to predict. But of course, this is critical because in many cases, the proximate impacts will be less severe than the knock-on impacts of these hazards. And I want to give you two real-world examples of this that we've already seen and that create the a indication of what we can expect in future. First, I know this is a widely, probably for many in this room, a widely overused example, but Syria. From 1998 to 2011, that country experienced its worst drought in at least 900 years. And scientists believe that it was made 2 to 3 times more likely as a result of climate change. The country suffered massive crop failures, which undermined livelihoods and forced millions of people to move from rural areas into the cities. That mass migration significantly exacerbated social stresses in Syrian cities, and this was a contributing factor. It wasn't the cause, of course, of the Syrian civil war, but it was a contributing factor to that Syrian civil war, and it had truly profound cascading impacts. A refugee crisis in the region became a refugee crisis in Europe, which in turn contributed to Brexit, which in turn contributed to the rise of populist governments, an unprecedented threat to the very survival of the European Union as an institution, and contributed to Angela Merkel's recent announcement that she won't be standing for office in future, will be stepping down in a sense. That's one example. Let me give you another. The food security crisis in 2010-11. In the first 7 months of 2010, there was an unprecedented heat wave. Again, climate science had determined that that was 3 times more likely as a result of climate change, this heat wave. It was a heat wave and drought that struck Russia. The intense and prolonged atmospheric blocking situation, which was associated with this extreme heat wave over Russia, simultaneously affected the South Asia subtropical monsoon, triggering record flooding, which created a humanitarian disaster affecting 20 million Pakistanis. In the meantime, in Russia, the extremely hot and dry weather triggered widespread wildfires. The links to different sorts of hazards can trigger each other, which damaged crops and increased air pollution in cities. 50,000 people died from respiratory illness and heat stress. But the drought not only struck Russia, but eastern China and the Ukraine as well, causing a reduction in their wheat harvests. Now, during the same period, on 2 completely different parts of the planet, in Australia and Canada, there was very heavy rainfall that also had major impacts on wheat harvests. This combination of impacts led to increases in the world market price, which in turn led China to make a large-scale wheat purchase to secure its domestic supply, and Russia to levy an export ban for the same reason. And this in turn led to major reductions in exports to Egypt, a spike in food prices where the public had not yet recovered from an earlier price hike in 2008, and also similar price increases elsewhere in the region, where it then became a major factor in the Arab Spring, in the conflict that ensued and the resulting fall of governments. I don't know if you remember protesters in Tunisia brandishing baguettes of bread, and the chants in Egypt as part of this Arab Spring were bread, freedom, and social justice. Now, climate change is increasing the likelihood of these cascading impacts, I believe, for 5 interconnected reasons. The first is that climate change is increasing the severity of many sudden onset hazards like cyclones. And if you look at Hurricane Harvey that struck the United States, which in the short time dumped 1,270 millimeters, equivalent to 127 billion tons of water on the US Gulf states in a matter of hours, it's indicative of the scale of this emerging threat. And with increasing severity, there are greater opportunities for cascading impacts, certainly in human systems, but also interactions with other hazards as well. The second reason is the increasing frequency of many extreme sudden onset hazards, so that we're seeing the likelihood of simultaneous hazards and hazards that strike in closer succession is going up. You know, just intuitively, if a 1 in 100 year event is becoming now a 1 in 20 year event, the likelihood that these things will happen more frequently or even back to back is increasing. There was some recent research which in some scenarios suggested that the 1 in 100 year catastrophic flooding event could become by the end of a century an annual event for most of the world's coastlines. And of course, communities are still recovering from the first sudden onset storm, and then they're buffeted by a second and can't cope. We already have examples of simultaneous hazards that occur naturally as part of our natural climate variability, the ENSO, the El Niño, La Niña. When we have this event, when we have an El Niño, it means there are simultaneous hazards that strike in different parts of the world. But with climate change, the IPCC says that the El Niño is going to be twice as frequent and stronger. They think the La Niña will stay about the same, but the El Niño will be twice as frequent and stronger. By the way, some of you may know the BOM has just recently updated its ENSO alert, its El Niño alert, saying there's a 70 to 75% chance of an El Niño developing later this year, which will increase the likelihood of a dry and warm end to the year across most of our country, and raising the risk of heat waves and bushfire weather in our South Australia, southern parts of Australia. The third reason these cascading impacts are increasing is that there are other changes happening to the patterns of these hazards. Storms and floods are hitting in new places. Bushfire season, the timing is changing. And all of these changes in the pattern mean that communities are less prepared and we're more likely to be surprised, and these impacts are more likely to cascade. The fourth reason is that climate change is not just increasing sudden onset hazards, but it is also increasing slow onset hazards through slowly increasing temperatures, for example, heat stress, sea level rise. These things are happening as well, which means, let me just give you one really worrying example of this. There was a study that climatologist James Hansen did recently. He looked at the decades 50s, 60s, and 70s and compared them to the subsequent 3 decades. And he found that the area of the planet experiencing extreme weather, extreme heat, for example, at any given moment had jumped from 0.1% in those first 3 decades to 10% in the subsequent 3 decades. That was from 0.6 degrees of warming. The small temperature increase, huge increase in the extremes. And so we have these slow onset changes happening. And of course, the fifth reason is the interactions between slow onset and sudden onset hazards. Because if you have communities that are living just on the margins, they're suffering heat stress, maybe the agriculture is becoming more marginal, and then they're hit by a bushfire, you can see that they're more exposed and less, and the impacts of the hazards that strike will be more severe. So it's the interactions between these slow onset and sudden onset hazards. So this is why I feel sadly fairly convinced that, and I know many of the colleagues that I speak to in the scientific community as well, that even though those IPCC reports are extremely disturbing, they are underestimates of what will actually happen in the real world, in which we're not looking at independent variables where we have these hazards striking simultaneously in a context of a slowly warming climate. So now I want to talk about what this means for the defense of Australia, because as I mentioned at the outset, this is a national security issue. Well, even without the effects of climate change, natural hazards already have an enormous impact here. More than 500 Australians, which is about the same number that died in all of the Vietnam War, die each year from heat stroke alone. And the annual economic costs of natural disasters are projected to increase to 39 billion by 2050, which is roughly equivalent to what we are spending currently on our Australian Defence Forces. Of course, climate change is going to dramatically increase the frequency and severity of many of these hazards. Already the number of record hot days in Australia has doubled, and heat waves have become longer and hotter. Short and more intense rainstorms that trigger flash floods and urban flooding are also becoming more frequent, and sea level has been rising at an accelerated rate since 1993. And Australians are hugely exposed to the hazards, and the broad range of hazards, in fact, that climate change is amplifying. 20% of our national GDP and 3.9 million Australians are in areas with high to extreme risk of tropical cyclones. About 11% of GDP and 2.2 million people are in places with high and extreme risk of bushfire. As the frequency of these extreme events increases, we will see an increase in simultaneous hazards and in extreme hazards that follow in closer succession and in cascading impacts. I was in North Queensland recently with some colleagues who were involved in rebuilding after Cyclone Debbie, and one of them made a poignant observation. He said, "We are recovering from a flood in a drought," by which he meant there was no access to water to mix with the gravel to fix the roads or to suppress the dust. And this is what we can expect increasingly. You have one hazard followed by another, followed by another. Communities may weather the first, but in their weakened state be overwhelmed by the second. Large parts of the country that are currently marginally viable for agriculture will be in chronic crisis from the compounding impacts of steady rise of temperature, drought, and bushfires. The scale of these impacts will be unprecedented, and the patterns the hazards take will change in ways that are really difficult to anticipate. Research suggests, for example, that cyclones, tropical cyclones, are forming further from the equator as the planet warms, shifting new areas of eastern Australia into the zone of intense storms, places like the Gold Coast, where building codes are not, for many structures, towers, have not been, or buildings have not been designed to deal with intense cyclones. This landscape of the emerging era of disasters is going to increasingly stretch emergency services, undermine community resilience, and escalate the economic costs and loss of life. There's an old adage that generals always fight the last war. And this is the situation we are in today with respect to climate change risk. We mistakenly base our strategies, policy assumptions, operational arrangements, and funding allocations on our experience of disasters in a stable climate, or with the expectation that the intensity of impacts from climate change will happen slowly and linearly instead of geometrically or exponentially. I suspect that within little more than a decade, these words from the Commonwealth Government's National Strategy for Disaster Resilience will seem poignantly outdated. And I'm quoting, "It is uncommon for a disaster to be so large that it is beyond the capacity of a state or territory government to deal with effectively. State and territory governments have arrangements with each other to share resources when necessary. In particular, major disasters or adverse events, a state or territory government may seek federal assistance." We need to begin preparing now for this future. A first step should be to create a compelling narrative about climate and disaster risk that explicitly recognizes the changing scale of the threat. The narrative should lead to the development of a national strategy for climate change and disaster resilience that codifies the required departure from business as usual. It should bring together the National Strategy for Disaster Reduction with Australia's National Climate Resilience Adaptation Strategy. It really makes no sense to keep these two strategies separate when 90% of major disasters are the climate and weather-related ones. Really, they should be brought together. Last year, the government established a National Resilience Task Force within the Department of Home Affairs to develop a national disaster risk reduction framework. And I just want to acknowledge Mark Crossweller's, who's sitting here in the front row, personal leadership in this process under huge, really unrealistic time pressures and with enormous jurisdictional, political, and bureaucratic pressures that you had to balance and manage in producing this document. I think this framework could be a very useful foundation from which to significantly scale up the attention to risks in a changing climate, and from which to build the broader strategy that I think is needed. An action plan emerging from the strategy should include the development of indicators of resilience at Commonwealth, state, and local levels, identification and implementation of incentives to promote private and public sector investment in resilient infrastructure, and broader socioeconomic environmental resilience, and an assessment of the exposure of critical infrastructure to hazards. The action pledge should increase our knowledge by promoting research at Australian universities and policy institutions into these cascading impacts, and on regional and subscale climate modeling, downscale modeling as well. It should also consider actions to address simultaneous and consecutive hazards, and review options such as financial support to states for economic recovery following disasters, and fodder banks and land banks to address the needs of communities in chronic crisis and the permanently displaced. Australia is not alone in this. For example, the latest IPCC report noted with high confidence that South Africa will lose about 45% and 80% of its currently suitable climate area under 2 and 3 degrees of warming, respectively. One of the prime objectives of the strategy should be to scale up Australia's efforts to prevent hazards such as extreme weather from becoming disasters. Currently, funding for mitigating disaster risk equates to only something like 3% of what the Commonwealth spends on post-disaster response. I do want to comment that the Commonwealth's new disaster recovery funding arrangements, which I think are launching actually today, ironically, is an important step forward. It allows states, for example, to reinvest savings from federal disaster recovery funding into measures to reduce future vulnerability to disasters. But really, this whole approach needs to be a much larger commitment at all levels of government, state and council level as well. Ultimately, it needs to move, and will, I suspect, from being a relatively incremental and exceptional top-up to restore damaged infrastructure, for example, to becoming really a standardized approach. To ensure that government bureaucracies prioritize the strategy and to oversee its development and at least its initial implementation, a National Resilience Coordination Committee should be established, chaired ideally by the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet, because other departments listen to PM&C, comprising senior representatives from Australian government departments, including defense, and from states and territories, the private sector, and civil society. And this should be matched by similar bodies at state level involving heads of state agencies, senior representatives from regional councils, the private sector, and civil society. To help promote the changes required, the Commonwealth could establish climate and disaster resilience champions, drawn from leaders in all sectors of society: Commonwealth, state, local government, parliamentarians, the private sector, civil society, and Indigenous leaders. States may eventually need to consider establishing statutory agencies with dedicated funding and legislated authority to support reconstruction following disasters, and with strong policy levers to build resilience to future disasters. And a scalable model to consider could be the Queensland Reconstruction Authority model, at least as a useful starting point. And states, of course, should ensure that flood maps, building codes, planning schemes, infrastructure delivery, and the supporting legislation fully incorporates climate change risk, including these possible cascading impacts, insofar as they can be anticipated. Generally, when major hazards strike, the states establish emergency disaster management committees, chaired by the Premier, to oversee the disaster response and the immediate recovery. State governments should consider extending the life of these committees beyond what maybe typically is around 6 months, to ensure that the reconstruction efforts embed preparedness for future disasters. As the climate continues to warm, it will become increasingly important to exploit the fact that every disaster is also an opportunity to build back better. It will also be important to have efficient processes in place to ensure that the lessons we learn from responding to these hazards are identified and incorporated into improvements. And the monitoring and assurance framework for emergency management recently issued by the Victorian government is a useful step in this direction. I think that federal, state, and local governments will ultimately need to begin coordinating managed retreats from areas of increasingly chronic crisis. Financial rebuilding assistance will need to shift to buying out flood and other disaster-damaged properties in highly exposed locations, and to subsidizing relocation and land swaps. And this is going to require overcoming some enormous political hurdles, as I've seen in meetings with some regional councils, including expectations concerning private property rights and the primacy of private property rights. I should also point out that these cascading impacts of climate change will be occurring outside of Australia and will also profoundly affect our security. For example, the collapse of coral reef-supported fisheries, combined with the disruption of agriculture due to more frequent droughts, floods, and storms, will have major impacts on food security. Scientists have determined that in Southeast Asia, for example, its per capita crop production will decline by 1/3 in 2 degrees of warming. And this could have, as I've said, major impacts on food security in our region, triggering people movements, unseating governments, and potentially contributing to the outbreak of conflict. These regional impacts could overstretch our operational capacities to respond, such as by creating demands on the Australian military to simultaneously support disaster relief in Australia and respond to a regional security challenge. It should be a very high priority for the government to identify opportunities to mitigate these impacts. And one important response would be for the Australian aid program to scale up its efforts to strengthen regional resilience to climate change. Colleagues, a number of prominent climate scientists have just published a major study in the US Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences suggesting that we may be entering this new era of disasters more rapidly than we realize. I'm quoting from the report. Our analysis suggests that the Earth system may be approaching a planetary threshold that could lock in a continuing rapid pathway toward much hotter conditions, hothouse Earth. This pathway would be propelled by strong intrinsic biogeophysical feedbacks, difficult to influence by human actions, a pathway that could not be reversed, steered, or substantially slowed. The impacts of a hothouse Earth pathway on human societies would likely be massive, sometimes abrupt, and undoubtedly disruptive. There is no military alliance, deployment of troops, or new weapon system that will adequately protect Australia from this rapidly escalating threat to our security. The only effective forward defense, to use a military terminology, is to reduce greenhouse gases globally as quickly as possible, including here in Australia. It is even the most narrowly defined conception of Australia's national security. It should be a very high priority for Australia to lead globally actions to reduce greenhouse gases, and of course for Australia to act both in Australia to reduce these greenhouse gases as quickly as possible. Without success on this front, even the most concerted efforts to strengthen the resilience of Australian communities will be overwhelmed by the scale of the hazards that lie ahead. Thank you.